BookTube today, I'm going to try and bridge the gap between my reading interest and do something that two big factions of my audience can enjoy. And I'm talking about my history readers and my fantasy readers. The concept is very straightforward. If you like this fantasy book or series, read this history book. So I fully recognize that there's probably some audience friction happening because I think a lot of book content creators tend to pick a lane with the genre that they talk about. And while they may veer off that path a touch every now and then, if they're veering, I'm swerving all over the place. So this is an attempt, again, to bridge the gap between my two favorite genres, which, again, the fantasy genre and history books. This idea was born from a contest that we held for my Patreon, where I asked for the best YouTube video idea. And the winner would get a pick between receiving a copy of Henry V by Dan Jones or a copy of The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne. And again, there's that friction, right? By the way, I did an interview with Gwynne on this channel. Go check that out if you haven't. He gave some amazing answers, and it was an honor to talk with him. I'm going to be talking more about his Bloodsworn saga later in this video, because if you've seen that interview, you probably already know the history book recommendations that I'm going to make for that. So anyway, one of our sickos, her name is Hope, suggested this idea, and I loved it. And I think what makes it so interesting to me is it allows me to showcase that history has some real drama to it. And with that drama, there are fiction writers that are constantly pulling from that into their fictional worlds. And to be honest, a lot of history, and this increases in intensity the further back that you go, a lot of history has this blend of fiction or myth or legend to it. And while that might be frustrating for historians trying to decipher, okay, this is 40% fact, or this legend is 60% fantasy, and vice versa, or even more extreme, so on and so forth, I personally love it, because you get some cuckoo bonkers stories like Alexander the Great's mother cavorting with Zeus in the form of a snake, and his father, Philip II, peeks through the crack and sees this happening and catches them red-handed, and as a punishment for spying on a god, he later loses his eye, and this is all foretold in a prophecy, and it goes on, and there's a plethora of stories like that out there. I mean, Alexander on his own, his story is rich with them. And that type of stuff and history and nonfiction in general actually ruined fiction for me for a long time. Like, I went about a decade after A Dance with Dragons was published before I came back to fiction genres. And it wasn't really until May 2023 that I really got hardcore back into them. And fantasy was a big part of that journey. And now I'm reading everything. But fantasy right now is a genre I didn't expect to love like I do, but here we are. So that's my winded intro into this idea. I hope you enjoy it. And since we mentioned it, let's actually kick some things off with the aforementioned John Gwynne. So his series is the Bloodsworn saga. You've got The Shadow of the Gods right there. The Hunger of the Gods is book 2. The Fury of the Gods is book 3, which just came out October 22nd. So this is a Norse-inspired series, and by that I mean the attitudes, the culture, the customs, the weaponry and armor, the kennings they use like Thought Cage and Battle Fame. The creatures and gods are plucked from or are an extension of the Vikings and or Norse mythology. And when I talked to Gwynne, I was delighted when he mentioned 2 books that he used a great deal in researching this world. The first one is Children of Ash and Elm by Neil Price. This is something that the History Sickos Book Club read early this year, and having read it, I'm not surprised that this was something that Gwynne relied on, because it is exhaustive. It is comprehensive. It covers so much about them beyond just the raiding and pillaging, although it covers that too. I mean, it's got everything from their mythology to what they were buried with, to what they ate. And Price is an archaeologist, it's very clear when you read this, and his type tend to get really stuck in on the details, which kind of split the group, because that can make it a rewarding and informative experience, but that can also make it a bit of a slog at certain points if you're not fully locked in on the topic being poured over. So buyer beware there. I guess this is a thick boy and very dense. Now, as a side note, I was particularly excited about how Price envisioned the future of Viking Age history, noting that what we knew 40 to 50 years ago is quite different from what we know today. And further discoveries will continue to move that study forward. This is because of the combined work of different masters coming from different fields, all different arenas in this. And about that, he says, quote, archaeologists in the field, laboratory, and library now have a greater potential for recovering the lives of past peoples than ever before, end quote. And that's not just exciting news for this topic, but also for history readers across all types of subjects. The second book that Gwynne mentioned was another that I've owned and read. It's the Saga of the Icelanders. This is the Icelandic version of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. It's epic, it's engaging, it's tragic. And much like how we would use the Iliad and the Odyssey and other foundation myths and legends across time, this one really helps us come to a better understanding with our Scandinavian subjects, with things like their code of honor, their ethics, their basic human dilemmas filtered through this culture. And these sagas are uniquely unforgiving and unvarnished, and they're full of lessons where small moments can take our characters down wildly different paths. The Viking Age of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries is often known as the Saga Age by Icelanders, and we have a wealth of what you would call historical fiction, maybe, stemming from that era, and a good deal is collected here. And as a final push to sell you on this, the final set in this collection by Penguin includes the Vinland sagas. If you've read the manga or watched the anime, this is what that's based on. For our next set, I'm going to talk about a little known series called A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Book 1 is A Game of Thrones. This is the series that showed me the type of fantasy reader that I was. The character work is masterful, the world building is epic, the vibe is gritty, there's political plotting and scheming, there's big set piece battles, and the magic is introduced in a slower fashion, which I like, more like a build up, which I particularly enjoyed with this. Now, it is no secret that Martin pulled from various historical events, but the biggest one was the Wars of the Roses. This was a series of civil wars between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, two rival branches of the Plantagenets, which they center around the English throne, and it took place from 1455 to 1487, and it eventually creates an opening for the Tudor dynasty, Tudor dynasty, to sneak in there and take over and rule England. There's several twists and turns, there's big battles, political fighting, and power plays. It's also pretty doggone complicated. Now, there's one author that always delivers on accessibility. And if you watch my video on history books for beginners, you can probably guess that I'm referring to Dan Jones. When I started my dive into English history about 4 years ago, I started with Jones. Now, I started with the Plantagenets, which is the longest reigning dynasty in England. They ruled from 1154 to 1485. And this book covers up to, I think, 1399. And this got me hooked. So right after that, I went right into the Wars of the Roses, which is this book right here, to further nail down on this topic. The narrative in the book here picks up at 1420, I believe, and I was not disappointed in this. In fact, I was so hooked that I went even deeper. So now you're getting into this like Russian nesting doll effect that I like to use when my brain snags on a particular topic. So for the next book, I went with The Brothers York by Thomas Penn. The Yorks, led by King Edward IV and his brothers George and Richard, come to be the leading force in the Wars of the Roses, but their rivalry sparked a lot of chaos and betrayal and violence. And this is a tragic story, and this book does a great job dissecting this triumvirate and all of the events surrounding them during this conflict that rips apart England. I highly recommend it. It is one of my all-timers, actually. Also, a fun tip on this that I always give when I talk about these, because it works so well for me, to give myself an extra comprehension boost, because there are so many players in this overall story, and they oftentimes have the same name, and they change names. What I did to keep them straight in my head was I watched the Stars Limited series, The White Queen and The White Princess. Not only are they awesome, in my opinion, but they really helped me separate all these players in the old brain ball. This book Iris Chang's book on the Nanking Massacre during the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945 has inspired at least a couple fantasy books. First, you have The Poppy War by RF Kuang. Now, full disclosure, I didn't love how much The Poppy War directly lifted from the events in the Nanking Massacre. At times, it felt less inspired by and more like a copy and paste, but I can appreciate that the author, through fiction, is trying to point you to a real history that is not well known enough and still has its deniers to this day. You may also be surprised to know that Emma Wang took inspiration from those events when she wrote The Sword of Kaigen, which at first has this like 16th century vibe to it, but it was actually much more modern than I expected as I got into it. And Wang's father is from the province where the massacre happened. And she says, quote, "Growing up, I had a weird relationship with Japan, basically trying to reconcile my fondness for modern Japanese culture and people with the genocide that affected the previous generation of my family and left a scar on the collective Chinese psyche. Fiction is the way that I process reality," end quote. And in this story, we kind of get a glimpse of some of that conflict, that contradiction that she speaks of in her characters. So if you love The Poppy War or The Sword of Kaigen, check out this book from Iris Chang. It's one that I've read twice. It's haunting. It will stick with you for a long time. And all three of these should be checked for trigger warnings, by the way, if you want to know exactly what you're in for, because there's some brutal stuff in these. Now let's rapid fire through some bonus recs, huh? How about it? We've got Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhoarse. This is book 1 in the Between Earth and Sky trilogy, and it's inspired by the pre-Columbian Americas. Now for that, you can go with something like Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs by Camilla Townsend. Or this one is actually really popular. You've got 1491 by Charles C. Mann. A series that I want to read very soon is Radiant Emperor, the series by Shelley Parker Chan. Book 1 is She Who Became the Sun. And the setting for this is 1345, when China is under rule of the Mongols. For the Mongols, I have a couple of book recommendations. You've got Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. Is it Genghis? Genghis? I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Either way, this is a great introduction to the subject of the Mongols, even if it's being a bit too kind to the Mongols and trying to repair their image, considering all the atrocities they committed along the way. So I'll give that qualifier there, but overall, again, solid introduction. And then you've got Genghis Khan's Greatest General, Subotai the Valiant by Richard A. Gabriel. I really should look up that pronunciation again. Chinggis, I guess, would be the way to do it. Anyway, this is a military history of possibly the most underrated general in history. I thought it was awesome. Now, very soon I'm going to be reading The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, which kicks off the Gale Song fantasy series. This is by Shauna Lawless. Now, if I've done my research correctly, and that's always a risk, this is based in Ireland around the 10th century and also incorporates a good deal of Irish mythology. So this is admittedly a blind spot for me. So I'm actually going to ask you on this one if you have any book recommendations for that period that I can further educate myself about this and kind of read along with this too. So please hit me in the comments. And while you're there, drop a like, smash the subscribe button. I thank you for spending the time with me today, and I hope you got something out of it. I appreciate y'all.